Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session on NBS Fall. Let me present our team. I'm Fiuka Sikova from the Institute for Environmental Science and Technology and Lab of Urban Environmental Justice at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. And the rest of the members of our team are Catherine Hersman from University of Bonn, also part of the Naturvation team, and Francesc Baró, my colleague, also from the Lab on Urban Environmental Justice at University of Barcelona. So the session that we have prepared for you today, we have decided to get rid of all the slides and to have more of a conversational format and to somehow reflect upon our research on Naturvation. Mostly our qualitative work around the issues of justice, inclusion, and governance and participation. So just one word on the kind of some of the qualitative research we've been doing within the project. We have been exploring about 18 world cities with multiple applications of nature-based solutions with about 54 interventions to find that most of them are either taking place in, let's say, more privileged parts of the urban areas, or their benefits eventually tend to accrue to people from the middle and upper class. For example, only 9 of our nature-based solutions had explicit consideration of justice in their deployment, and seven of them were actually community gardens, which were struggling to remain alive and thriving. So why is that? Well, the issues of kind of the relationship between greening and gentrification, for example, have been touched a lot during the session today. For example, the session on investment in nature-based solution, Maria Bochkarova and Wouter Botzen talked about the green premium, which actually building and living next to a green area tends to be paid by the dwellers around. So there's a lot of research going on with that. But we furthermore find that nature-based solutions tend to align with, let's say, more ornamental, more decorative, more non-intrusive forms of nature that are orchestrated in a way that more easily aligns with development goals, just because of the idea that we need to kind of attract private investments, right? So, but then what actually happens is that nature-based solutions tend to act as quick sustainability fixes, rather than just like engaging with the deeper roots of sustainability challenges. So our issue is that this approach to NBS, to nature-based solutions, might not actually profoundly address the issues of air pollution, public health, climate change, adaptation, and equity. Because in order to kind of really address these problems, we need to kind of touch upon the logic of capital accumulation, neoliberal governance, the type of urbanization which addresses short-term investment horizon, and actually for-profit logic, which could be problematic for certain type of population, also for nature, extractivism, and the way extractivism in non-urban areas relates with urban areas and urban nature, exploitation of human and non-human labor, acceleration of life, traffic, and actually the pervasive doctrine of economic growth. So actually, when designing nature-based solutions, unless we actually address somehow the logic of extractivism, the logic of growth, the logic of kind of social inequality, we might create a type of greens that are actually, we might plug greens, which is kind of aesthetic and contribute a little bit to green identification, but they would not create a kind of change at a deeper level. So the question for me is like, how can we create nature-based solutions which are accessible, collaborative, kind of caring, but also confronting the current type of development? But before moving on to that, I'll switch off to Catherine and I would ask her, when we talk about nature-based solutions and exclusivity, which I mentioned about, which are the social groups that actually are mostly excluded from nature-based solutions and why?
Yeah, thank you, Vilka. I think what I have to say here won't surprise many people. When we're looking at the groups that are most excluded from nature-based solutions, we are sadly looking at the very groups that already frequent the parts of our social statistics, of research on social inequality, again and again. So we are looking at migrants and refugees who, in addition to usually resource issues, often also face access issues to public discourse in general, be that through language, be that because of stereotypes in society, hostilities towards migrants, be that because of problems with formal citizenship rights, and so on, so on. We're looking at young people, children. Quite often, children, young people are charged with responsibilities for environmental protection without actually being given the kinds of rights to nature that perhaps they ought to also enjoy as citizens. We might be considering elderly residents who are facing particular obstacles in terms of accessing public discussions and participating. We might be looking at people with care responsibilities and the very practicalities of their lives. How do you engage in planning processes, in consultation processes when your lives are just so busy? We have those kinds of issues reflected again and again in the participation literature, but we're not necessarily very good at actually bringing planning to those groups of people. And that was said earlier by Carl Beckerstrand in the very first panel, in the opening panel. Going to people and reaching them where they are, picking up where they are, is absolutely key. We could consider people with disabilities as a particularly marginalized group. And of course, more generally, people from poorer backgrounds, from socially disadvantaged backgrounds, who, in addition to financial and resource obstacles, might face stigmatizations, they might face the expert climate in our consultation processes intimidating, and therefore feel alienated and not participate and not come forward to participating. So there's a lot of generic issues that are shared between these groups in terms of whether they're actually being considered, whether planning goes to them. But in addition to those kinds of issues, we're also seeing quite often that in an effort to compensate for that, we have dominant representatives cropping up again and again in our consultation. And we need to be extremely careful that we don't fall into the trap of again and again listening to the same voices, always also needing to question what are their interests, are they giving us a full picture? And of course, generally, community groups as well are up against very powerful interests. And I think that's been reflected across the day already today. The need to tackle those powerful interests, and therefore the need that we have for alliances and for advocacy and for intermediaries. But I've started to mention here some of the things that could be done, and I would like to hand over now to Frances with a question, a very important concrete question of what can be done to make NBS more inclusive.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. This is a bit the million-dollar question as well, but you start with some of the hints that we can use for answering. In order to answer these questions, basically I will refer to a publication, a paper that I contributed some time ago, and I will put then the reference to the chat in the platform, which basically tried to address this question and suggested 6 main prerequisites for socially inclusive urban green space development. And I will try to synthesize these 6 prerequisites here, and then start the discussion with the audience. That I think it's going to be the interesting part of the session now. So the first prerequisite that we consider in this paper was that the deliberate acknowledgement and consideration of socio-spatial inequalities in the planning, implementation, and monitoring of greening strategies by scientists and planners. So to have this acknowledgement, because sometimes planners and scientists, when working with nature-based solution or greening strategies, doesn't consider this, let's say, particularity of cities, now that these existing inequalities that we have in cities. So the second prerequisite was also to consider and include not only, this has been popping up also in previous sessions, but not only include different groups of actors into the design, planning, and implementation of urban green areas, or strategies, but also different opinions and, as far as possible, contrasting views, needs and demands of stakeholders in cities, including tacit and community knowledge. So the third prerequisite was also the acknowledgement and in-depth treatment of existing trade-offs between ecological and social processes or outcomes in NBS strategies, in nature-based solutions strategies or projects. Something that it has also been mentioned in previous sessions, the fact that some projects related to nature can also trigger inequalities at the social level. Then a fourth prerequisite was that green spaces or NBS, nature-based solutions, are planned and managed regardless of top-down, bottom-up approach only, in a way that we can serve as places of encounter for different groups of people. So this idea that nature-based solutions can be kind of a boundary concept to put together different views or different stakeholders, urban stakeholders in the same table. The fifth prerequisite was that what we call a multi-actor governance structure to steer greening agendas in cities, such as governance structures that may include national and local governments together with civil society organizations to ensure an inclusive representation of all residents and to prevent what I told before about the side effects of nature-based solutions. And finally, the sixth one, prerequisite was that even if we focus on environmental issues, we as researchers should explicitly look also at the political and economic context and related power constellations to avoid underestimating the inclusion of greening into market-oriented strategies and pay more attention to these ambivalences or trade-offs. So this idea that sometimes the greening strategies are embedded in this market-oriented projects with let's say sometimes doesn't have this inclusion or this social view that should be considered in this kind of projects. And with this, I would like to start the discussion from the audience. I don't know if there was there was a question for, I think that Hilka can answer, but to this question is where they can find more information on these 18 cities that you have been mentioning at the beginning that has been assessed more in depth in Naturvation.
Yeah, the website of Naturvation is kind of has a section on mainstreaming nature-based solutions, and in there you could look at one report which is called the International Comparison Report on Nature-Based Solutions, and there is, I will send the exact link over there, but we have a kind of almost 100-page report which is comparing our work across all the nature-based solutions. But after this session, we could also go down to the Zoom, to the kind of Hive, and try to see whether there's some more technical questions. We could provide more, let's say, links to our work. But if there, I'll warm up the chat and I would invite everyone to somehow pose their questions, doubts, kind of considerations with respect to what was presented so far. But meanwhile, I was wondering, I had one question for you, Francesc, in terms of, but also Katrin, which has to do with like making the governance of nature-based solutions more inclusive. And let's say, which are the barriers? Which are the barriers in terms of like planning? Which are the barriers at the level of governance in the sense of politics? But which are the governance also in terms of culture? Is it the same to kind of to include, let's say, middle class white residents, or let's say migrants, unprivileged, let's say people of color, which are having more kind of living in a bit more precarious way. So do you think, Katrin, that we might need different types of engagement for the different groups of, and because we know that citizens are not a uniform category, and we need to kind of consider that they're kind of very diverse way of living and experiencing nature. So I was wondering whether Katrin, but also you, Francesc, would like to reflect upon the cultural specificity around including particular type of vulnerable groups in the planning for nature-based solutions.
Perhaps if I can start or kick off the answering that question, I do think a lot has to do with an expert culture. It does take a lot to get out of our familiar environments, to unlearn the way we have been speaking, and I include myself in that. In research contexts, academic conferences, we acquire a particular way of talking that is not particularly helpful. And likewise, if you're coming from a municipal planning background, you will have paragraphs flying around in your head, regulations, rules, new terms. Suddenly we're talking about nature-based solutions. Now, if we're only just becoming familiar with those terms, what do we then do when we take them into public arenas and speak to those kinds of groups in particular? So we need to do a lot of translating, but that job in itself is not enough. I think the most important thing is to start with a curiosity about what participants can bring to planning processes. What are their local knowledges? Advocacy planning does this, community-based work does this, appreciative inquiry starts from that premise, looking at resources that communities already have, and in fact that in itself can be a learning process for some of those communities. If they are very stigmatized, if they have a lot of other issues, then seeing resources within the community itself is a really important step and something that may have to be done first. But that's looking at the nitty-gritty, and if we lift our gaze a little bit, then I guess we are looking at municipalities that do need to spend money on this. Need to employ people to conduct those kinds of very, very patient, painstaking processes. In Leipzig, for instance, in the city where I've been living for the last few years, we have quarter managers who are often themselves residents in the area. They provide a bridge and a link, and there is some public finance going into that kind of work. So putting your money where your heart is of course really, really important. And last but not least, too often in the literature and in our discussions, I still see that view that somehow this is all too much effort and it doesn't get you anywhere. It leads to unearthing more conflict and so on, so on. So what I would like to really see is a greater perception that that conflict is necessary. And we may be working more towards a compromise rather than a consensus sometimes. But we're not just doing this for box ticking. We're doing this to make the solutions that we're finding more adapted to the needs that people have. Frances, how about you? What kinds of obstacles do you still see coming up in research around how NBS unfolds in practice?
I think that your answer was so comprehensive that I was wondering if maybe we could move to one of the questions that it has been posed in the chat. This is the question of green gentrification that it has also appeared in previous sessions, I believe. And actually, if I say, well, it was Fruti who asked, yeah, how can the benefits of nature be brought to poorer neighborhoods who currently usually suffer from a lack of nature without pushing out the original population? So that's the issue of green gentrification. And then Amanda said that we are looking at the ways to increase the capital distribution. At a very simple level, we are thinking if the village should be within an X minute walk to a high quality NBS. Is that a good place to start? So the idea to, I would say, try to address green gentrification by providing distributional or equitable accessibility to green spaces, to a nature-based solution. This is a kind of, let's say, the first thing that it could come to one's mind in order to address green gentrification. So if you put equally green space in the city, then in theory, there is no gentrification because more or less all the neighborhoods have this access to green space. But I have that, I mean, in my experience, this is not going to happen, and maybe we can reflect maybe with Filka and also with Catherine that I think that in the urban context, in the cities that we are living in, there is always the risk from disadvantaged residents to be pushed out of the city. Even if this city has green space everywhere, then the city itself will be gentrified. So all the city will be gentrified, and these vulnerable residents will be pushed out to maybe to more the other cities in the periphery with less green space or whatever. So I think that, yes, of course, we should try to go for an equitable distribution of nature-based solutions and green space, but I don't think that this is the only solution. So, and then now we can discuss a bit of what are the tools available for cities to avoid this process of gentrification, of green gentrification, or gentrification more generally. And many of them also go through to the protection of the housing of these residents and through social housing strategies and so on. But I don't want to expand more on this. Maybe Filka or Catherine has other opinions on that question.
Yeah, it basically has to do with the fact that when we implement greening in vulnerable areas, we need to combine somehow the nature-based solutions with social housing policies. So, for example, with policies like maximum rents or rent control, and somehow come together with other type of regulations which are not with the domain of nature-based solutions. So here the importance of working across sectors and across jurisdictions, because unless we do something about rent control, even distribution of greening might somehow result in in less affordability of housing and eventually push people out. And indeed, it's that's happening not only with greening, that's happening with, let's say, with making more, let's say, pedestrian areas and somehow or improving the profile of the air with some urbanizational beautifications. So in that sense, I would I could build upon another question that was out there which was about from Olivia Bina, which is saying that the problem is not the problem is not conflict, but lack of space. Well, I would say, what is the reason why there is no space in the first place? I mean, the particular form of urbanization that we are following, it has its logic. Let's say, so far, urban development has prioritized traffic, has prioritized certain type of urban needs, which have to do with speed, which have to do with provision of goods, which have to do with certain type of material welfare. So probably we need to rethink our cities in the sense of, okay, what was the logic which is creating this lack of space in this particular form of density in the first place, and what if we try to reimagine our cities as slower and less competitive, less hooked on the need to constantly increase GDP and economic outputs, but let's say redistribute economic benefits. Then in that sense, probably we will not prioritize and give premium on land, on barren land, in the sense of providing new office buildings or we would actually think about restructuring urban areas and reducing, let's say, highways and space distributed for for urban traffic to urban greening. Of course, that would negatively affect the economic outputs of the city, and that would might have create negative implications in terms of job creation. That's an important point to have. It's not always true that actually authentic nature-based solutions might be creating jobs in the first place. They might be replacing certain type of polluting and contaminating jobs, but for these jobs to be turning green, perhaps we need other type of policies, let's say basic income, and let's say other type of job guarantee instruments until we can have reskilling. I'm just saying that we just can't really think of nature-based solutions providing jobs without thinking of the entire structure of the local economy. I took a lot of time. I would give the word now to Catherine to address one of the other questions that have been let's say, emerging.
Yeah, I think I saw one question that was posed earlier by Amanda, which I think is really interesting and very, very significant. She's asking what kinds of indicators or goals we should be considering. So in a way, how do we know that an NBS is more inclusive, that it is more accessible? For instance, could we be thinking about how long it takes an individual to walk to a park, a particular green space? What kinds of indicators might be helpful? I'm wondering, Frances, if you have any suggestions for that question. Have you come across particular ways of assessing accessibility that you think are particularly helpful?
I mean, there are a lot of indicators to try to assess the accessibility to green space in cities. Something that I would say that is not I mean, the typical assessments of accessibility to green space in cities, they have a kind of residential access assumption. So, but I think it's also important when we talk about accessibility and different groups in cities, it's also not only where people live, but also where people work and play. And for example, in our lab, we have been recently working on a paper that we don't look at the accessibility to green space from residential, so where people live, but from school, so from where children are going to school. So we have tried to see what is the greening within the schools and around the schools, and this we could also try to assess with other kind of, let's say, urban amenities in cities like I don't know, like senior centers or hospitals. So I think it's important to consider this equal distribution of green spaces from a residential point of view, but also from other types of amenities and facilities in cities.
Perhaps if I can come in just with one brief suggestion also on that. In addition to looking at where people are actually encountering urban nature, also look at the diversity of people that are using them. And that can be done in a range of ways, both through observation as well as through more statistical measuring. So actually considering whether you're reaching the kind of diversity that you would expect to see reflected in a particular urban green space could be another way of looking at indicators. Silke, I think we may be running out of time here. I'll hand over to you. So, Silke, I think you're on mute. Are you bringing our session to a close? Okay, so while Silke is on mute, may I bring our session to a close at this point? And thank you all for the participants in the background for your very, very inspiring questions and the tremendously helpful suggestions that you have been giving us here. I think going through the comments, we're learning a lot ourselves, as is always the case. So thank you very much. And hopefully we'll get to meet at some point in our professional futures. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.